In some breaking news coming in, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, who addressed a press conference a short while ago, has said that if there is a third world war, it could only be a nuclear war. He also says US President Joe Biden has said the only alternative to sanctions is a third world war. But those prospects are only in the heads of Western politicians and is not in the heads of the Russian people. Those are the details here. But let me, bring in some perspective here. Maroof Raza is joining me on the broadcast. Thank you so much, Maroof, for joining us. How do you read these statements? Because, the words nuclear war is something that has been swirling around, whether with Russia putting nuclear forces on alert. But obviously, it's an extremely scary proposition to even hear statements like these being made.
Quite frankly, these don't rattle me because I understand a little more than the average Joe about how much these statements can be translated into reality. Let me put it in context. The first thing is that those who wield nuclear weapons and who are really, really responsible for their usage, that is essentially politico-military commanders, they understand that these weapons are weapons of mass deterrence and not destruction. The only time nuclear weapons have been used, as we all know, were used twice by America to end World War II. But since then, the study of nuclear weapons and the threats that are made are essentially about the non-use of nuclear weapons. There was a Russian leader, a pretty irresponsible chap in the past after the Cold War, that the West had propped up as a bit of a buffoon, President Yeltsin. And he also did make some statements about the use of nuclear weapons. Whether he was sane or drunk, one can't tell, because that was his persona most of the time. But Putin is a very, very sharp, calculating man. And Mr. Lavrov, who has made these statements, has been, again, a very strong advocate of getting Russia back onto the pedestal of geopolitics where it was before the Cold War. He was Russia's ambassador at the UN when Russia's supported regime in Serbia and Kosovo was hammered out by the Western Alliance without a UN formal resolution for them to do that. They called it a humanitarian action, but I don't know how humanitarian it can be when you go in with fighter bombers to remove an existing government. They bombed it for 78 days. Russia's pleas fell on deaf ears, whether it was Putin's or Mr. Lavrov. So Lavrov has now made this statement, and prior to that, a former Russian president who's a close confidant of Mr. Putin, he shuttles between being president and prime minister, is Mr. Medvedev, who has also made these suggestions. This is essentially to deter the Western world to try and stop the Russian invasion going to its cumulative end as the Russian leadership has planned, which is the capture of Ukraine. And if there is a confrontation between the armies of Russia and the Western world, we will see massive military confrontation, if at all. But when you study nuclear strategy, you realize that in the 44 rungs of reaction that are there between the time a nation gets hold of nuclear weapons and a nation decides to use them, halfway through the channel, there are no decisions taken in considering the use of nuclear weapons. So therefore, 22 rungs have to be climbed before you even deliberate on that. Let me bring you closer home. In the case of India-Pakistan, in all the standoffs between India and Pakistan, studies have shown, interviews have told us that whether it was Operation Brass Tacks and Pakistani threats and America's fear that there would be a nuclear war, or in Kargil, at no stage the military commanders of both sides even seriously considered looking at the use of nuclear weapons, because it is called, the concept is called mutually assured destruction. It's not that it's going to be a one-sided affair.
Yes.
If one side uses, the other side will use it. The other side will use more, the other side will use even more. So it's called force, counter-force strategy. And in all that, they know at the end of the day, you may have nuclear bombs, but so do the others. So if you want to go up in high heavens because of your ambition not being fulfilled in Ukraine, then that's a call you have to take. But I don't think, and I assert that again, I don't think we are looking at the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. The possibility of a global conflict expanding beyond Ukraine still exists, but not a nuclear conflict.
Yes, Maroof, but isn't that, one of the reasons that US has also cited for not, sending their troops on ground or even into the skies? Because if that happens, if there is a direct confrontation between Russia and any of the US troops, it then means that two nuclear empowered nations are warring with each other, and that is obviously not a good idea. Isn't that one reason that was put in front for not doing that?
No, that may be an outside reason, but please understand, India and Pakistan are nuclear weapon states. India and China are nuclear weapon states. So that possibility exists even in our part of the world.
Yes.
But all nuclear weapon holding states know that it is one thing to pronounce about the possibility of nuclear conflict. It's another thing to actually arm your warheads on top of delivery systems and start thinking of using it, not using it, thinking of. Let me tell you, in the case of the US and Europe, they have a psychological problem getting involved in conflicts where there could be massive physical damage to their troops and their personnel. They like to win, as John Simpson of BBC once wrote. They like to fight and win winnable wars. This doesn't look like a winnable war for them. And secondly, all their military thinking over the last 2.5 decades or so has been structured around fighting a war without dirtying your hands. At the end of the day, I said to many Americans and think tanks years ago, you want to control the world, you have to be able to send in troops who are prepared to die. You don't control the world just by flashing dollar bills.
Yes, in fact, Maroof, just diverting a little bit in terms of the situation on ground at this point in time and what's happening. The war or the invasion has entered a second week now. Ukraine seems determined to continue fighting and not give in. How do you think, in terms of the actual, the shelling, the bombing, all the conflict that's happening in Ukraine, how are both sides positioned right now?
Well, Ukraine's put up one hell of a good fight.
Yes.
And my hat's off to Mr. Zelensky. Whatever his other shortcomings, he's turned out to be one hell of a fighter. As far as Russia is concerned, it certainly slowed them down because they had calculated that in a week's time, they'd be able to run over most of their cities, including Kyiv. They haven't been able to do that, but doesn't mean that Russia is going to stop. 2-3 things which Russia is likely to do. It's going to step up its operations to bomb the hell out of the cities where there is resistance. They're going about it in phases. All military plans are based on phases. You look at a map, a military man always looks out a map and draws a line that this is where on day 1 my men will reach, this is there on day 3, 4, 5. So those plans are in place. Those templates are cellophane templates that are put on top of the real map or likewise put on computer sheets and seen in war rooms. So they are going systematically upwards. Yes, some of them are hammering at Kyiv, but Kyiv is closer to the Russian border or the Belarus border from where Russian troops are coming in, and so is Kharkiv. But there are other places that have to be captured so that systematically the Russian invasion moves upwards. My guess is threefold. One is, considering the heavy opposition they're getting, they might just surround Kyiv and wait for the siege to break them down, both because of lack of resources and people, lose their nerves after a while. When your blood is too hot, but when it cools down, then reality hits you that, there's no way you can stall the Russians coming in. The second possibility is that they'll occupy areas right up to the Dnieper River, which really dissects Ukraine into two halves. So about 40% east of the river is eastern Ukraine, which is what Russia will try and control even after the conflict is brought to an end at the minimum. The maximalist position for Russia is to control all of Ukraine and get that president out of there and stop the conflict and say, we've achieved our aims, we've shown our nose and thumbed our nose to the NATO. we've captured enough territory of Ukraine to create a buffer between Western world and NATO and Russia. And three, we've shown that when we want to do something, we mean business and we will do it. Because Russia knows the unwillingness on the part of the Western world to stand up and fight, especially in Europe, and Europe in particular is both interdependent on Russia for trade and business and gas, inasmuch as Russia is interdependent on Europe for a variety of financial institutions and actions. So all that put together, my assumption is sanctions per se will not stop them. What would have stopped them was an announcement before the start of the conflict that Ukraine is not going to join NATO at least for another 10 years. We can meet at a suitable time and discuss a solution. The West didn't do it. And there are many political scientists in the West who are actually asserting that Mr. Biden wanted a war, wanted to open the market for American arms manufacturers, wanted Europe to militarize, wanted to bury the ghost of Afghanistan, and wanted to assert American supremacy over Russia, which they tend to think only in economic terms, but Russia has got an economic backer in the form of China, which is actually the biggest beneficiary of this whole confusion.
Right. And one final question, Maroof, quick question on the fact that will that be enough for Russia if Ukraine says, you know, we don't want NATO and gives them that assurance? Is that going to be sufficient for Russia? And in terms of, you know, the talks that are going to happen or that are happening, what are the possibilities there? How will that pan out?
Well, it has to be signed and sealed as a declaration, whether it will come out of Minsk or whether it will come out of Berlin or whether it will come out of Paris or wherever. There has to be all conflicts end after negotiations and a formal declaration is signed and sealed, because there is the sanctity of nation states that has to be held up to the signature of the head of state promising something. Unless that is done, I don't think Russia is going to admit that has been enough. But what is clearly also Russia's agenda, other than territory, is the economic heft of Ukraine. It is the breadbasket of Europe, if not for the better part of the world. 30% of the world's grain comes from Ukraine. So it's equivalent roughly to how much oil Saudi Arabia produces for the world. So whether you drive cars or not, you still want to eat. And the second thing that Ukraine provides is a hell of a lot of mineral resources. Ukraine has uranium iron ores, it has iron ores, it has magnesium, it has titanium. So some of the top mineral resources of the world come from Ukraine. I think Russia has been eyeing it all along because that is going to be a shot in the arm to the Russian economy. And of course, Ukraine was a former nuclear pad for the Russians against NATO. There are nuclear facilities that still exist, which haven't been totally destroyed. Perhaps Russia is going to use them because Russia's strength is really arms industry and nuclear weapons.
All right, Maroof, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us and putting all of that into perspective.